Well, hello and welcome to podcast number 3 of the Sacred Path School. And this week we're going to talk about visioning and values. Okay, so you might recall that in the last session, so podcast number 2, we had a look at some of the concepts around my life as a project and what the implications were from an existential perspective. So this week I want to pick into that model a little bit more, or dig into that model a little bit more, the past, present, future model, and look at what the implications of worldviews and stories are for visioning. I'll also have a look at the neurocognitive science stuff and what the implications are for the way that the brain wants to operate, so the way the brain wants to be right the whole time, and what the implications of that are. Look at the concept of them and freedom. Also have a look at being and becoming. The benefit of working in cycles, thinking about cycles. Experimentation and play, which leads on from that. And then we're going to have a look at values, so the importance of values as aspirations, head, hand, heart perspective, and also defining moments and the implications for belief. So let's just start off with regard to the implications of your worldview. So you might remember that in the first podcast I introduced the existential framework, the past, present, future framework. And I explained to you that the key relationship from an existential perspective is between being and time. So most of us can think back, over a period of time and see how our state of being has changed over time. And as I said, the brain really wants to set and forget. So the brain wants to kind of think in more linear way. But if you use the existential framework, the past, present, future framework, you can divide that relationship, I suppose the time relationship more specifically, into those 3 realms. So remember that, remember if you break it down, so break down the 3 past, present, future realm, and remember that in the first podcast I talked about, so we begin pretty much as a blank sheet, and then, so if you think about babies and that sort of stuff, and then you have a variety of experiences, and your parents teach you and significant others teach you about what is right and wrong. You get a little bit older and you form opinions and judgments about things. And remember, critically, you learn these 2 key stories. So the first story is how the world works, and as I said, that tends to be it's like a big picture paradigm of how the world works, tends to be quite sort of culturally based. And the second story is who you are. All right? Now, that collectively forms your fixed view of the world. So when you are experiencing something new, the first thing your brain wants to do is look back to that stuff and pattern match. So if you think about the neurocognitive science material, so essentially from a neurocognitive science perspective, we make decisions using 2 basic decision-making processes. So systems 1 thinking is a subconscious pattern matching process. So basically when you're just pattern matching against the past. And systems 2 thinking is higher order conscious reasoning. Now, higher order conscious reasoning uses about 4 times as much energy as subconscious pattern matching. So from a survival perspective, we're trying to save energy, right? So we're trying to save energy. So we default into subconscious pattern matching. So the brain basically wants to be lazy. The brain doesn't want to think about things. The brain just wants to pattern match. Now that has some pretty significant implications for visioning. So remember in the second podcast, we got to the point of talking about visioning and saying, okay, so where do you start with this sort of stuff? If you want to change things, what you need to do is go and do some visioning. So resist the temptation to, when faced with a problem, resist the temptation to immediately look back to the past and do analysis and think, what's wrong with me? How do I fix myself? And instead flip it around the other way and do visioning. And you might recall that when we were talking about visioning, I said you could do visioning in, I'll just bring it up if you're watching this. Remember I said you can do visioning in 5 different areas. So physical, mental, emotional, material, and spiritual. And remember, it's quite easy to get a read on how you're going in those 5 different areas. You can say, okay, so out of 10 physically, so eating well, sleeping well, exercising well, how are you going out of 10? And you'll get an intuitive judgment, I suppose, about how you're going. Might be 5 or 6 or whatever. And then you can flip around the other way and say, okay, so what does good actually look like? All right. Now, if we go back to that idea of having these stories, right? So A worldview, and B, a story about who you are, that has pretty significant implications for your visioning. Because, for example, if you believe that the way the world works is, let me think about it. So good things only come to people who, have it passed down from their parents or something like that, or circumstance is the most important thing, something like that. Then that's going to have implications for what you believe is possible in the world. All right. So if you believe that you can only get ahead if you already start with something, then obviously that's going to limit your possibilities, I suppose, with regard to your visioning. Similarly, if you have a story about who you are, and all of us have a story about who we are, right? And remember, that story has often been told to us by them, right? And them being significant others in our life, whether it be our parents, grandparents, teachers, whatever. As you grow, people tell you about who you are, what you're good at, what you're not good at, right? And then remember what the brain wants to do. So the brain pattern matches against the past the whole time. And what will hold you in that past-present loop is rational, logical thinking, right? So the brain, if you have a story, for example, that I think we talked about this in one of the other podcasts. So if you have a story in your head that you are an introvert and you're not very good at public speaking, and you've had a series of maybe you have an aspiration that you want to get up and be a leader or talk in front of people or something, but you've had a series of experiences that were negative. So maybe you got up to speak one time and you lost your place in your notes and started bumbling around, or you had another instance where you got up to speak and you were so nervous that you were all sweaty, or you were so nervous that your voice was wavering or something like that. Then what happens is that creates an emotional marker in the brain, right? So it's a traumatic experience, so you have an emotional reaction to that experience, and that lays down a marker in the brain. So when you come to speak again, so maybe you're getting ready to speak, right? And your brain is basically looking around, oh, I'm getting ready to speak here, right? So remember, the subconscious pattern matching part of your brain is pattern matching against past experiences. And so your brain will dredge up those negative past experiences and reinforce to you in a very rational, logical way that no, you should not be getting up and doing public speaking because you're not good at public speaking, you're nervous or whatever, and this is not who you are, therefore basically get back in your box, okay? So see how the stories that you tell have significant implications for what you believe is possible when it comes to doing visioning. And this is what Heidegger and Sartre talked about with regard to the influence of them, right? Because they influence what you believe is possible by telling you who you are. And remember, in the last podcast, we talked quite a lot about freedom. So freedom, to a very large extent, is to be free of them, or free of the influence of them. Because if you are free of the influence of them, then you can see all possibilities. So when you're doing your visioning, you're not limited in your mind by thinking about, what you're being told. You are free to explore all different possibilities. Now, there's another key issue here. So remember, in the first podcast, we were talking about, again, your perspective on how the world works. And the first key question you need to ask is, what is your belief between destiny and free will? Now, this is the same sort of thing. So if you believe in destiny And so it may be that you've been brought up in whatever sort of spiritual or religious teachings that may have one of the key teachings may have been that you are sent here for a particular purpose. And interestingly enough, if you sit in a workshop and you ask people, do you believe that you are here for a particular reason or a particular purpose? About 2/3 of people will say, "Yep, I believe that." Right? But then if you say to them, "Okay, so do you know what that purpose is?" The majority of people will say no. Okay, which is why it's really interesting and useful to be able to do this process of visioning, but also why it's interesting and important to pick apart some of these, I suppose, foundational type beliefs that, again, limit what you believe is possible from a visioning perspective. Okay, now, so if you believe that, and then most of us, again, just to be clear about this, so most of us, again, believe in some sort of mixture between destiny and free will, right? So that maybe we are brought into this world with some predetermined purpose or destiny or something like that, but we have free will around maybe how we enact that or the things that we bring into our life. Very few of us would believe completely in free will. So in other words, that it's going to have complete blank slate. You can basically create what you want to create. And obviously, again, the circumstances of our lives will have implications for that. And again, coming back to the belief, the implications of belief, what you believe about how the world works, again, is going to influence that. So see how this is all like mashed together and quite complicated, but it's why it's important to spend some time to ask some of these foundational type questions to pull apart what your foundation beliefs are and therefore what the implications are for visioning. All right. The other thing to take into account here, so just, I suppose, just quickly to recap there, all right? So when you're doing visioning, so ideally from an existential perspective, you should be doing visioning and refreshing vision. I would say to you, we'll talk about cycles in a minute, but I would say to you, you should be refreshing vision probably on a yearly sort of basis, okay? And so there's implications for your visioning practice with regard to your worldview, so how the world works, how you believe the world works, and there's implications for your visioning about who you believe you are and the stories that you have been told about who you are. Right? So there's benefit in picking that apart and trying to find ways of letting go of that's effectively baggage, letting go of that baggage so that you can be free to properly vision in your life. The other thing that you should take into account here is that the brain wants to be right. Okay, so the brain wants to be right. The brain wants to be right even if it wants to be right around a belief that has negative implications for you. Right? This is a weird thing that happens in the brain. So for example, let's go back to that example before where you have an aspiration that maybe you want to be able to get up and speak in front of people, but you have formed the view based on factual evidence from the past that you are crap at public speaking, and every time that happens you are become nervous, etc., can't actually do it. Okay, so you have this big internal conflict because you have this aspiration that you want to do it, but you have the belief that you can't do it. And part of you might be very frustrated with yourself because you see that you're self-sabotaging because you keep bringing up all this negative stuff and blah, 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 blah. And so again, you have internal conflict going on, which again diminishes your capacity to use your energy to actually create what you want to create in the world. Now, the problem is that the brain wants to be right. Okay, so even in that instance, that view that you're crap at public speaking, that has negative implications for you because it is at odds with what you want to create in the world, but the brain wants to be right. So the brain is going to keep focusing on information that supports that view, right? So this is the confirmation bias issue. The brain is going to keep focusing on the information even though the story that you're telling about yourself is a negative story that's going to have negative implications for what you want to create in the world. All right, see how weird that is? So this is why, again, from an existential perspective, you should never go looking for what's wrong with you. right? You should never go, oh, far out, what's wrong with me? How do I fix myself? Because in doing that, you're going backwards, you're going back into the past, and you're basically going down the rabbit hole, right? From an existential perspective, what you should be doing is A, making peace with the present, right? So what's happening right now is perfect, and I'm at peace in the present moment. And again, this is why it is useful to be able to do mindfulness type exercises like meditation, yoga, etc., 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 right? Because remember, in the present moment, the brain is going to react to events before you even have an opportunity to think about what you actually want to create, right? That's the pattern matching process. So again, benefit in using activities, using things like, again, mindfulness, presencing, breathing, etc., to be as present as possible, so that you can act, remember, you can act intentionally, which is orientated towards the future, rather than reacting. Okay. Okay, now, the next thing I want to talk about is being and becoming. Now, so the other thing about this is to understand that from an existential perspective, we're talking about being, so being in the world and the benefits of being, etc. Right? But everything is always changing all the time, right? So that there are always things which are becoming. And again, Heidegger and Sartre talked quite a lot about this, about the idea of becoming. And from a visioning perspective, ideally what you want to be doing is to be planting seeds in the future, right, that come into the present. So as time moves along, those seeds that you plant in the future come into fruition in the present moment. And remember, again, it's worthwhile to be clear around what the time orientation is from an existential perspective. So from a Socratic perspective, time basically goes from the past into the present and into the future. So we project things forwards, which is why if we're faced with a challenge in the present moment from a Socratic type perspective, what you should do is look backwards, do analysis, look for the root cause of the problem, solve the problem, project it forwards. Okay. From an existential perspective, again, what we're trying to do is to be as free as possible of the past, so we have complete freedom to create what we want to create in the world. So what you're doing is looking towards the future, planting some seed, doing some visioning. Okay, so what is possible in the future? What do I want to create? And again, which is why it's important to try and be free of them. And I'll come back to that process in a sec. And then basically to plant those seeds and see what happens as they come into the present moment. So just back to what I said a minute ago about you should never look for what's wrong. So from an existential perspective and from this past, present, future perspective, you're really looking at everything as the flow of energy, okay? And so in the present moment, so as I said, your first task, make peace with the present and ideally with the past. And then turn it around the other way and ask the question of, okay, so what do I actually want to create in the world? So a good analogy to use is if you think about a big pot of stew that's been sitting on the stove for a period of time, all the big bits basically sink to the bottom. Now, when you start doing visioning, basically what you're doing is you start to stir the pot, right? And as you start to stir the pot, bits will start to come up to the surface, right? Now, as the bits come up to the surface, so as you're doing visioning, the bits that will come up to the surface will be those beliefs or views that either you have formed or other people have told you what is possible. So remember, they told you about, you can't do this because blah, 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 blah. Now, as that comes up, your task is simply to listen. Listen to what's coming up. Write it down, right? And then from there, ideally, what you want to do is decide whether or not you want to keep that view. And obviously, if they're negative and limiting views, you don't want to keep them. So then the only way to release that out of your system is to bring that past back into the present, which is what you're doing by stirring the pot. And then to say, okay, so what action can I take to release this limiting view? And in doing that, what you're trying to do is to let go of baggage. Like, let go of the heavy things that you've been carrying along or dragging along that have limited your view on what is possible to create in your world. And a good way of thinking about this is, if you imagine that at the start of life, so you come into life and you're there right at the start, and they say to you, they, again, they, God, whatever, says to you, okay, so your task is to get up to the top of that mountain over there, and they point you over to the top of this mountain. There's a trail in front of you, and they go, okay, follow this trail, it's going to get you to the top of the mountain. And by the way, here's a big sack to take on your back to pick up and carry anything useful you find along the way. So you go, okay. So you start off on your life journey, I suppose, and as you walk along the path, you see really interesting things that you pick up and you put into your bag, okay? And then periodically what happens is you get to one of those big, so you're going up into the mountains, and you get to one of those big ravines with like a, Raiders of the Lost Ark hanging bridge going across it. And you're a bit scared, right? But you think, no, I'm going to cross the bridge. So you go to take a step onto the bridge, and you realize as you take a step onto the bridge that your bag, you've got so much stuff in your bag that your bag is so big that it won't actually fit between the rails of the bridge. So your task at that point, or your challenge, I suppose, at that point, is to stop, either give up on the journey forwards, right? And often there'll be like a really nice, bar just over to the right-hand side, on the edge of the ravine with a whole lot of your friends there who are all yelling at you going, hey, don't worry about it. Don't worry about going further on the journey. Just come and sit down with us and relax. Or if you want to continue on the journey, you need to take the sack off your back and pull all the stuff out of your sack, which is all your baggage, and decide which bits you want to keep and which bits you want to let go of, okay? So that's the process of being able to be free of them, is to A, do the visioning stuff, B, listen really closely for what comes up, and then if negative stuff comes up, pull it all out, examine it, right, and decide whether you want to keep it, and if you don't want to keep it, decide what sort of action you can take to release it out of your being. Okay, and none of that is about trying to fix yourself. None of that is about trying to work out what's wrong with you or anything like that. It's all about trying to make yourself as free and as light as possible to be able to create what you want to create in the world. Right, so in that way, things are always becoming. Right, and often, I'll say one more thing about this, and again, if you're watching this, you can see the video. The other thing just to note about this, okay, which is really important, is that when you're stepping out of your comfort zone, so when you're trying to create something new, so again, whether it be, I want to get up and speak in front of people, or when I get up and follow my dreams or whatever, it's scary. It's really scary. Because and it's risky because you're stepping out of your comfort zone. You've never done it before. Sometimes it goes against the stories that you've been told about who you are and what's possible, etc., etc. And it can be challenging, and you're going to have more setbacks and whatever you want to call it, failures or whatever, than if you basically just stay in your box. Now, everybody, I think, starts off in life with dreams, visions and aspirations. And especially as children, like most of us have the will, if you like, to try those things because, we haven't been hurt, so we haven't got those emotional scars from negative experience, so we haven't laid down a marker in the past that our brain is going to pattern match against, okay? But what happens as we grow older is many of us face those challenges and have negative experiences, and so it can become so painful that we make a conscious decision that we're not going to step over into that area anymore, and instead what we're going to do is basically stay in that present past loop, mark out our territory, right, and defend it. And the way we defend it is using very rational, logical thinking to tell people why things aren't possible and why it's safer to stay here. So remember in the previous podcast I talk about the superpowers being curiosity and gratitude. Okay, so curiosity is going to drive you towards, I wonder what would happen if I did this, I wonder what would happen if I did that. And the negatives or the poison are cynicism and sarcasm. So somebody who has been hurt a lot and has decided that it's too hard and basically the world is stuffed and all that sort of stuff and it's basically retreated into their box, is basically buying into cynicism. Right? So you can't believe in something that there's no evidence. And so again, we're going back to the whole idea of faith. So faith is belief in something where there's no direct evidence, and instead you're buying into cynicism, and obviously sarcasm as well diminishes your capacity to trust yourself and trust others. So you can be in your, you can give up on that and be in your box, but in doing that, you let go of the possibility of creating dreams and aspirations, right? Which obviously I would suggest to you is not an ideal way of being. All right, so let's just have a look at the idea of cycles. So the other thing to be aware of with this is the role of cycles and of working in a cyclical way, okay? And this relates very closely to the idea of becoming. So if you think about, again, I talked about these loops, about future present loops and past present loops, etc. So the brain, remember the brain experiences something, the brain wants to pattern match against the past, pick an experience from the past, maybe make a slight improvement and project it into the future. So the brain wants to work in a very linear type way. Fixed thinking, though, will trap you in a way of thinking that, so obviously if you're, had negative past experience, it will trap you in that negativity. And what you want to be able to do is to work in cycles, right? So we want to think, I wonder what happened if I did this. And then you go and do it, right? See what happens, come back around. And what we're trying to do is work intentionally. So we're trying to play, and we're trying to let go of or negate the need of the brain to be right. Because remember, if the brain wants to be right, the brain wants to be fixed and solid. And what we want to do is we want to play around with things. So there's benefit in establishing cycles in your life and being able to work that way. And I talked a little bit in the last podcast about the benefit of establishing daily practice. So daily practice is really about establishing a daily cycle, right? That's going to enable you to orientate towards what you want to create in the world and that future present realm, as opposed to reacting against events as they occur. And by definition, if you're reacting, what you're going to do is pattern match against the past. So I would suggest to you the first thing to work out is a daily cycle, so daily practice. And again, ideally from daily practice, what you do in the morning is establish intention, because again, we want to orientate towards being intentional and proactive. During the day, check in with your intention. If you're off track, just acknowledge and redirect. So again, don't create the internal conflict in the mind where you're starting to go, oh, you stupid idiot, why did you do that, blah, 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 and beating yourself up. Because if you're beating yourself up, you're wasting energy and negating the possibility of creating what you want to create in your world. And then the end of the day, remember what we want to do is we want to orientate upwards. So we want to create these cycles of ascension. So we want to walk a sacred path, okay? So end of the day, you want to ask, what should I do right today? Okay, so we want to negate the brain's desire to go into what went wrong today and how do I fix it. So we want to ask, what should I do right today? So focus on what went right. And then the second thing is, what am I grateful for? So that's the daily cycle. Outside of that, I would suggest embedding a weekly cycle. So a weekly cycle, you're going to ask the same sort of stuff. So what did I do right this week? What am I grateful for? What's my key intention for next week? So see how we're thinking about things differently and trying to orientate differently. Then I would also do a monthly cycle, same sort of thing. And then outside of that, I'm going to have like a yearly cycle. And so once a year, I'm going to check in with vision. What are you up to? Are you on the right track? Is anything need to pay attention to anything else? And basically create that around a year. Now, interestingly enough, you can also think about this, and again, this depends on what your belief is on the way the world works. So if you believe, for example, in the idea of reincarnation, then this life is one big circular cycle. Okay, and also there's implications there for the idea of destiny and fate. So if you believe that you come into this world with some particular purpose, obviously you come in with an intention, you go around your whole cycle of life, right, and you go back into the die, go back into the realm, come around again. Okay, always again I would say to you is to try and orientate towards creating ascension cycles. So we can go up through life, and no matter what your circumstances of life are, so that in some way you improve. All right, so that's visioning. And obviously we're going to talk more and more about this through the podcast, the idea of visioning. But what I'm trying to do here is, I suppose, create a framework so you can pull some of this stuff apart. Now, the other thing to be aware of is values. So we talk a lot about values, especially in organizations, you know, what the organization's values, blah, 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 right? But it's useful to ask, you know, what are we actually talking about with regard to values? Let me just click through a couple of these slides if you're watching this. Just hang on a sec. All right, here we go. Okay, so values are basically our foundations, right? For what we see as being most important in life. And there's a quote on the screen if you're watching it, John Paul Mellencamp quote, "If we don't stand for something, we'll fall for anything." Right? So if we don't stand for something, we'll fall for anything. So our values are taught to us, again, from our parents and significant others when we're young. And mostly they're taught to us through anecdotes. So for example, you might have been taught, you know, what goes around comes around. So that's the idea of karma and about actually, you know, putting out into the world what you want to come back to you, etc. You might have been taught things like, you know, the benefit of hard work, the benefit of like getting up early in the morning, you know, the early bird catches the worm, things like that. The benefit of, you know, telling the truth. So if you tell the truth, you know, people can trust you, etc. And why is that important? Right? Now, values are aspirational. So if you ask people, I'll give you an example. So if you ask people, do you believe in the value of honesty? Most people say yes. And then you say, okay, so have you never told a lie? And most people, pretty much all people obviously, will say, yes, I've told a lie. And then you need to ask the question of, so see how we're going, future, aspirations, present, so it's actions, and then past is subjective judgment, so stories and things, okay? So if we go from the future, the aspiration is to be honest. In the present moment, you tell a lie, right? And as the present goes to the past, then we make a judgment. So is the judgment, okay, that means you're a liar. And people say, no, I'm not a liar. So yeah, but you lied. So yes, well, I did it because blah, 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 blah. So there'll be a justification for why that person lied, right? So does that mean if you lied, then you should give up on the aspiration of honesty? No. No. I don't want to give up on the aspiration of honesty. So you see how we reorientate towards aspiring to be honest. So in that way, values are always aspirational. And it almost doesn't matter which value it is, but most of us are going to fail from time to time with the values. Now, that's why it's really important to understand that you need a reset process. So you're going to fail. Does that mean you're going to give up on yourself? No, you're going to reset. You're going to acknowledge that you've failed, reset, and reorientate towards the future of being aspirational. The other thing about being values, and so just to note here, so a bit of research was done a few years ago on whether or not there are common values that are common across different cultures and basically across the world. And the answer is yes. So the common values are love, unity, fairness, freedom, tolerance, truthfulness, responsibility, and respect for life. Okay, so it doesn't matter which culture, what background, people will hold these values common. Okay. So it's worthwhile to understand that values are based in the head, where we're intellectually convinced of something, based in the heart, where we are affected by something's worthwhile, so we feel it. Okay? And then based in the hand, where they commit us to action. Right? So it's not enough just to talk about values. You need to like dig into it and understand how it makes you feel and what you're actually going to do about it. The other thing about values is that they can be instrumental, which enable us to achieve various ends or goals in our lives. So instrumental type values will be things like profitability, efficiency, etc. So see how they allow us to achieve various ends, timeliness, etc. Or they can be intrinsic, so they're valuable in themselves, whatever the conditions of life. So intrinsic values are things like freedom, justice, fairness, and unity, for example. Also, you should understand that with regard to values, we go through periods in our lives or experience in our lives which are called defining moments. So this is the work of, if you're curious, Joseph Badaracco at Harvard University talked quite a lot about this and has written a book about this called Defining Moments. So defining moments are the moments in our lives where we have to choose between right and right. So note that it's not right versus wrong, because the right versus wrong, the black and white type decisions, they're actually quite easy to make. Right? It's the right versus right questions that are hard to make. So those experiences, they cause us to question what we really believe in and what we are willing to do about it. And you should note that a value is not a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it. And the price that you will pay to uphold your values will be in relation to a particular outcome. So you might have to relinquish an outcome to be able to uphold a particular value. And if you're not willing to relinquish the outcome to uphold the value, then guess what? As I said, the value is not a value. So defining moments put us in positions where we have to make a decision between which value we are going to uphold. And again, as I said, we may pay some sort of price for it. And the classic, I suppose, example with regard to values is that if you're in Nazi Germany in Second World War, and there's a knock on the door, and your Jewish neighbours come to you and say, "Look, the SS is in the area. Can we come and hide in your attic?" And so you think about it, and they're friends of yours. They see the value of friendship, value of compassion, etc. And you say, "Yes, yes, yes. Of course you can." Right, so they go and hide in your attic. A few days pass by, there's another bang, bang, bang on the door. You're going to answer the door, and the SS is at the door, and they say to you, "Do you have any Jews hiding in your attic?" Right, now, you might believe in the value of honesty, but you also believe in the value of respect for life and empathy and friendliness, etc., being friends. And so you negate the value of honesty and you lie. Say, "No, there's nobody here." Right? Of course, if you get found out that you're lying, you're going to pay a price for upholding that value. But many people, and most people I would suggest you, are going to be willing to pay that price. So see how the interaction between the different values work, and see how values are aspirational. And the important relationship to dig into here is the relationship between intentions, actions, and justifications. Right? We can go into the whole right-wrong stuff, and again, in a later podcast, we'll talk about ethics, and of course, why would people do bad things? Right? So you can go into the whole right-wrong stuff, but what's more interesting to go into is to look at the relationship between intentions, actions, and justifications. And it's also why it's so important to do visioning, to work out what is your intention, why you actually want to create that in your life, and again, to be able to stir the pot and to release yourself of some of the limiting beliefs that you may have, what would you say, sort of collected or picked up through your life, or might have been imposed on you from them. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. So that's a little bit about visioning and values. Hope you found that useful, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.